Hello, folks. Welcome to episode 5 of season 2 of the GOAT series. I'm your host, Jeremy Hadler. Welcome to Jeremy Hadler's YouTube channel. And today I'll be talking about the greatest Eagles player in franchise history as of this moment, folks, with special guest Dr. Michael Mudrick here. And we're going to be going over the rules here, but I brought in my expert on the Eagles here, who's a Eagles fan for probably 30, 40, not 60. He's too young for that. But yeah, so we have that of our Eagles expert here. But let me go over the rules here to remind you guys of how we do the GOAT series like I always do. We choose 5 candidates of who we think is the greatest Eagles player for this episode, specifically in franchise history up to this point. The criteria we look for candidates is accomplishments, tenure for the team, how they played with them, of their abilities and skills, stats with their franchise. That's how it will be during this episode, and on and off the field, what impact they made with the team. And we also do an honorable mention, as I always do, but our guest here has the opportunity to have an honorable mention if they want to do it, which we have it this episode. So if they choose to, we'll get to have it. And at the end of the video, we choose our ultimate GOAT here of the Eagles here for this episode. So we'll be going from honorable mention to starting to players as the other candidates here, folks. So before we start, though, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you've not done so. We would appreciate it. We'll leave it to the guest here to start off his honorable mention. Dr. Michael Mudrick, what do you got here?
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. So one thing I would say as we're building this list, I think there's some clear-cut names at the top, and then there's a lot of really good names slightly underneath. And so I know who you have in mind in terms of an honorable mention. So I guess I'll just go, I'll agree with your idea for honorable mention. So let's just get started. You have Donovan McNabb on your honorable mention consideration list. I'm going to agree with you on that. Now I know, he had been a bit of a polarizing figure as an Eagles quarterback. When you think about his statistics, first all time in passing yards, most passing TDs with the Eagles, and just all of the success that team had. Mm-hmm. Now, I know you're not an Eagles fan, obviously, but, you grew up during that era.
Yep.
And we're aware of just how good they were. And we know about the shortcomings and all that. And whether that was McNabb, whether it was the coach, whatever, you go to 5 straight NFC championship games and you're the starting quarterback of that team, you're pretty successful. And I think the big thing to consider with McNabb, and I'm not telling anything that Eagles fans don't know, other than the year that he had Terrell Owens, he did most of it with a lack of wide receiver support. I mean, he had the year before Todd Pinkston and James Thrash, as Eagles fans will tell you, it would drive them crazy. Nice role players, but none of them were dominant number 1 receivers. Andy Reid at that time, I want to build with a quarterback and a line. I'm going to scheme the receivers to get open. He didn't think you needed a number 1 receiver. It wasn't until, their 3rd straight NFC championship loss that kind of pushed the needle to then go out and acquire Terrell Owens. But point being, for most of McNabb's career, he did not in Philadelphia have a number 1 receiver. And so put up those numbers to have that kind of success. Yes, it was a team venture. They had a really well-balanced team during those years, but to do it without a number 1 receiver, he needs to get credit for that.
Definitely. He played 11 seasons with the Eagles. He was the 2nd overall pick in the 1999 draft, 6-time Pro Bowler, made the Eagles Hall of Fame, got retired with the Eagles. Stats, he had first all-time passing yards, first in TDs too, but his completion percentage does bring it down for me. 59 completion percentage does hurt a little bit, but he also wasn't just like good passer too. He also could run. He had 3,249 rushing yards, 28 rushing TDs, and he had 21 game-winning drives too. He was very mobile as a quarterback too. Let's not forget that.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I think, some of the injuries early in the career, tends to happen with a lot of quarterbacks, impacts the mobility. And then he, decided that, amongst other things, he wanted to be a little bit more of a pocket passer, toward the middle of his career. But yeah, I mean, people forget how fun it was to watch him. When he came to the team in his early years, especially when he was more open to running, it reminded a lot of us of another honorable mention that I would put on this list, and that would be Randall Cunningham. I know that's obviously before your time. Randall had an up and down career with the Eagles, had a late blossom when he went to Minnesota at the end of his career, when he actually had some support around him. But Eagles fans will tell you, Randall Cunningham was must-see TV when he first came into the league. In terms of a pure physical skill set, the 2 best quarterbacks I've ever seen play for the Eagles are probably Randall Cunningham and Mike Vick, in terms of the dynamic running, the arm strength, all of that. I mean, Randall was that guy in the mid to late 80s. And the knock on him, unfortunately, unfortunately, was that they never really did anything in the playoffs. I don't think I think it might have been even his last year with the Eagles that he finally won a playoff game, and that was him coming in relief. They had some shortcomings in the playoffs. I was still fairly young at that time. I was born in 84, so I wasn't as entrenched, but it's my best understanding and from the conversations I've had with people that it was more so on the coaching staff that didn't invest in an offensive line. Buddy Ryan was all about defense. And certainly Buddy built a great defense, and we'll talk about, one of those defenders today, but Randall had no offensive line whatsoever. And even when they did try to invest with first round picks, like a guy named Antone Davis, Leonard Williams, I think might have been during that time, they were busts, unfortunately, for Randall. So if they would have been able to hold Randall up and give him a little bit more support, who knows what could have happened. He had some decent receivers. Fred Barnett, Calvin Williams, had a really good tight end in Keith Jackson, had some decent running backs, but just as we know, the game being won in the trenches, he had no support really on the offensive line. So he was a guy that you tuned in to watch him play. People have talked about him in terms of pop culture, hip hop artists and such. He was that guy. So I would put him on my list as well for honorable mention.
Let's move on to our next player here. This guy played 14 seasons with the Eagles. He just retired with them. He was a 6th-round pick when most people, when you think of 6th-round pick, you're either boom or bust or just a depth position just to fill out there. That is Jason Kelce. Big Yeti is what the nickname I've heard. There's probably other nicknames Dr. Metric would know, but he is a phenomenal guy. He's a beast. Remember the QB sneak? We obviously know about that of Jalen Hurts, but he's a 1-time Super Bowl champion, 6 first-team All-Pro, 7-time Pro Bowler, set the record for most consecutive franchise starts for the Eagles, leveraged his way around the trenches like against bigger, stronger defensive linemen, and he was a consistent, great player overall. What do you think about him, Dr. Metric?
Yeah, I mean, he has to be up there. To me, he's even in contention for top. Personally, I put, Pro Bowls are great, but I think Pro Bowls have to be taken with a grain of salt because so many players don't go to the Pro Bowl. And I'm not saying Jason Kelce didn't deserve any of the times he was named, but sometimes there are players who are like, oh, they made Pro Bowl. But yeah, it's because so many players either opted out because of whatever reasons or couldn't play because they're playing in the Super Bowl. When you make All Pro, that really is saying something. It's saying you are the best at that position. To be a 6-time first team All Pro, especially to do it at his age, to get the majority of those first team All Pros in the early to mid 30s. We could tell when he started with the Eagles that there was something special there, but how he reinvented his game and took it to another level in the later years, can't say enough of that. But also just given that there really was no weakness in his game. He certainly was a mauler, as we want to say, as cliched as that sounds, in rushing offense. He certainly wasn't big, as we all know, but just his athleticism and ability to get in space. I mean, a lot of their sweep runs to the outside, it's all because of Jason Kelce and his athleticism and able to shed off the initial block off the snap and then get to the outside, and create holes for the running backs. I mean, he was able to do that, but then also was a great pass blocker. Called one thing as an Eagles fan that I look at for this year is with him retiring, he was the one calling all the defensive alignments, at the line of scrimmage. And countless times you would hear opposing players say just how good he was at figuring out what they were about to send to the quarterback. And so that is one thing that I am curious, who is that going? Is that going to go to Jalen Hurts next year? Is whoever is if Cam Jurgens is center, is he going to take him? So, the complete package of pass blocking, run blocking, just smarts. And then obviously being a team leader, he didn't get penalized a ton in his career. And then, as part of your criteria, just on and off field, the value of a franchise, I truly contend, and maybe this is a little bit of a recency bias, there is no athlete that resonated with the city of Philadelphia like Jason Kelce did. Talk ad nauseum about, his speech at the Super Bowl parade, his speech when he retired certainly resonated that. Just everything that he did and how he carried himself embodied a Philadelphia athlete. And he is a guy that people will be able to wear his jersey forever because of what he meant. I think there's a lot of intangible value to that.
I don't think anyone's going to wear his costume, but definitely his jersey, though, I would say. Like, that speech, like, I'm not an Eagles fan, as I mentioned, like, I'm a Packers fan. But hearing that speech, that was, like, one of the best speeches I ever heard. Retirement and Super Bowl speeches, like, one of the best I've ever heard in my life.
I mean, his story resonated, too, with a non-scholarship player. He was a walk-on at first at Cincinnati. Being a 6th-round pick, most 6th-round picks, as we know, don't make it. But not only being a 6th-round pick and then being able to contribute right away, it was just the perfect story.
Next player we move on is a guy nicknamed Concrete Charlie, who played linebacker and center for the Philadelphia Eagles for 13 seasons. He was the first overall pick in 1949. That is Chuck Bednarik. Chuck Bednarik is a 2-time NFL champion, 10 first-team All-Pro, 8-time Pro Bowlers, Hall of Famer, Eagles Hall of Fame, retired with the Eagles. Stats for him, which the stats you really couldn't calculate during his time. 20 interceptions, 1 TD, 21 fumble recoveries, according to Pro Football Reference. He passed away back in 2015, so rest in peace for him. The thing I like to bring up quickly before I hand it over to Dr. Mudrick. During the 1960 NFL Championship was between both our teams, me, the Packers, and Dr. Mudrick's Eagles. Jim Taylor, who was the Packers running back at the time, was at the Eagles' 8-yard line. They ran with Taylor for one more play for the final seconds to take off the clock here and there. He sat on Taylor purposely to let the clock run out, so the Packers could not run another play, which the clock did run out and helped preserve the Eagles' victory, win the 1960 championship game 17-13. So because of that, the NFL influenced the rule that you cannot waste the time of being like on top of a player the whole entire time. So because of that, that's how the Eagles won the championship, by stopping that incredible play, but establishing the rule you cannot be on top of the player the whole time.
Yeah, it's hard to go against. Obviously, it's NFL Hall of Famer Chuck Bednarik. The thing that really stood out to me, and I know this was common back when he played in the 50s and 60s, is the fact that he was a two-way player. You know, he did it at an extremely, extremely high level. So being an all NFL, receiving all NFL accolades as a center, but then also being an all NFL linebacker as well, that in and of itself is as impressive as it gets. And I know the game was a lot different back then, but let's not discount, there still was plenty of physicality. There was even less, equipment to dominate at the line of scrimmage and at linebacker for a complete game for over the course of not just a season, but multiple seasons. I mean, to me, I won't say that's unheard of because that's what they did back then, but to do it at such a high level, really speaks to how dominant he was. And again, as I mentioned before, I'm enamored by all first team all pro selections. And as you made note, being a 10-time first team all pro, that, shows you how dominant he was at those positions. Score some extra points, just like with Kelsey, score some extra points for winning a championship and basically being a catalyst, being a leader on a team that won that championship. For many folks, he's also a part of one of the most iconic pictures in NFL history when he absolutely destroyed Frank Gifford on a play. Frank Gifford, I think Gifford was playing for New York at that time, and he took him out. And then, kind of a foreshadowing to celebrations that we have nowadays, maybe not as gaudy, but just like looked over him, kind of taunted him and put his arm up like it. And there was a great iconic image of him just kind of looking over, kind of like when Iverson walked over Tyronn Lue, glared at him. It was basically the same thing with him kind of looking down with his arm up. I think Frank Gifford had to, get carted off the field. It was a pretty serious injury. It's not something to joke about, but that is an iconic image when it comes to NFL football during that period. And Chuck Bednarik was a part of that.
Definitely big hitter and effective tackler, playing linebacker, but also like a good blocker, a center. That's like, you don't see that very often. Two-way players like him, Deion Sanders, if you want to consider back in his play. There's not that many two-way players. The way he dominated, like by playing both positions, just never hear that. Him getting the first team all pros like multiple times on each side, that just shows dominance. So you got Jason Kelsey pretty much on your one side. Then you got a great linebacker on another side. Moving on to our next player. This guy was running back, nicknamed the Moving Van, played 8 seasons for the Eagles. He was a 5th overall pick. That is Steve Van Buren, Moving Van, 5th overall pick in his draft. He's a Hall of Famer, 2-time NFL champion, 5 first-team All-Pro, 2 second-team All-Pro, 4-time rushing yards leader, 4-time NFL rushing TDs leader, 1-time NFL scoring leader, made the Eagles Hall of Fame. He retired his number with the Eagles, number 15. His stats, folks: 5,860 rushing yards, which is 4th all-time in Eagles franchise history. 69 rushing TDs, 1st all-time. Not only did he play in the rushing game, but he also was good in the return game. He had over 2,500 returning yards, 5 return TDs. He passed away in 2012. Rest in peace for him. Dr. Mudrick, what do you think about him?
Yeah, I mean, the stats speak for themselves. Obviously, I far away from during the time when Steve Van Buren played for the Eagles, but kind of what you've alluded to, it back in those days, you needed a bell cow running back, as cliched as that sounds, and he was that prototypical power running back, and it was also indicative of him scoring so many rushing touchdowns. And statistically, it's hard to argue with him on that list. Now, when you do look at who are the Eagles' all-time leading rushers, this could potentially be an honorable mention. And it's interesting because he was only, in my opinion, with the Eagles in such a short period of time, but I certainly wouldn't put him in a top 4 for the Eagles. But their number one rusher, to no surprise, recently is that of LaShawn McCoy. And when you think about what McCoy did in terms of being the leading rusher from a yardage standpoint, but also playing less years than a Van Buren and some of his other predecessors at running back, also impresses me. So I do want to use this as an opportunity to give an honorable mention to LaShawn McCoy, because I do think when you are the all-time leading rusher for an organization, you should be considered in that mix. But, I think in terms of what Van Buren represented for the Eagles during that time frame, how the game was played, I can't argue with him being on that list.
Definitely. I mean, LaShawn McCoy definitely gets an honorable mention. Like, I went to his best game ever in Eagle franchise history against the Lions in a snow game, which was awesome to go there for my first NFL. Very questionable Kelly trade of going to the Buffalo Bills with LaShawn McCoy. If he had stayed with the Eagles, he could have potentially gotten better and could have maybe outbeaten Steve Van Buren and maybe won a Super Bowl for the Eagles too. Yeah. So it could have been that.
I'm also a big Pro Football Reference guy, and every statistical metric is certainly going to have its positives and its shortcomings. But, they have this approximate value, which is kind of like their version of like a war in baseball, where they're basically assigning a metric to a player based on their contributions. But what I do like, it's my understanding that with the approximate value, they do try to adjust for your peers. I teach a stat class, and one example in a stat class will say is like, who's the best quarterback of all time? Is it Joe Montana or is it Tom Brady? And how can we measure that from a statistical standpoint? Well, one thing we'll do is we'll take both of their stats and we'll try to standardize them, because Montana played in a different era against different peers, competition. Brady played against different peers in competition. How can we try to standardize them and see who has the higher numbers? So their approximate value metric actually has neither of them as the Eagles' top running back and has Wilbert Montgomery on there. So I definitely think that from that perspective, we need to give Wilbert some love as an honorable mention. And as we know, in terms of, fan lore, one of the best moments in franchise history was Wilbert's big touchdown run against the Cowboys in the 1981 NFC Championship game to lead them to the Super Bowl.
All right, let's move on to our next player. And then we got one more player left after that. This player, nicknamed Weapon X, I like to call him. Best intro dance coming out of the tunnel. That's one of the best. Played 13 seasons for the Eagles. That is Brian Dawkins, Weapon X, I like to call him. He came from the Eagles as a second-round pick. He's a Hall of Famer, 4 first-team All-Pro, 7-time Pro Bowler, made the Eagles Hall of Fame, retired for the Eagles. He technically did win a Super Bowl for the Eagles, but that was as an advisor during the Eagles won their Super Bowl, technically, but not as a player, though. And for stats, real quick, he had 34 interceptions, tied for most in Eagles history, 132 passes defended, first all-time in Eagles franchise history, 32 forced fumbles, first all-time, 21 sacks, 914 tackles. Dr. Metric, I'll leave the floor to you.
Arguably my favorite player of all time, so I'm glad to see him on this list. Statistically, everything you said, speaks for why he was so great and why he ended up becoming an NFL Hall of Famer. The one thing that stands out to me with Brian Dawkins on the field, in my opinion, he was not a liability in any way, shape, or form. Pass coverage, nope. I mean, and the stats defend that as well. Most interceptions, tied for most in Eagles history. Most passes defended in Eagles history. So you want to put him up in the box and stop the run? Absolutely. I mean, look at all the fumbles that he forced. He was so good coming off the blitz. And part of it was he was a perfect marriage with the defensive coordinator, Jim Johnson, at that time. I mean, Jim had a lot of tools to work with some of those defenses, but he knew how to use Dawkins's intelligence, but his speed and athleticism to his advantage. And when he had brought in Dawkins on a blitz, or, if Dawkins was covering someone in the flat, he made the play. And that was just him. He was Mr. Reliable, similar to Concrete Charlie, dropping Frank Gifford, one of the most iconic defensive plays for more of the younger Eagles fans is probably going to involve Brian Dawkins, and it's going to involve the 2005 NFC Championship game. They're playing the Falcons. Mike Vick hits Algie Crumpler over the middle of the field. Now, this hit wouldn't be legal nowadays. Things were different 20 years ago. Dawkins comes in. Now, it wasn't a helmet-to-helmet hit, but Dawkins, he was a defenseless receiver. Dawkins comes in and just annihilates him. Crumpler, give him credit, he still held on to the ball, but the hit was so jarring, it set the tone. The crowd kind of got reinvigorated in the game at that time. And it sent a message to both Crumpler and the Falcons about whose territory that was. And absolutely, I think that had an outcome on how they went across the middle later.
Yep.
It also just riled the team. It was an iconic play. And to your point, it's just a shame that because he was such a notable player for that franchise, that he was never able to win a Super Bowl with them as a player. And it still is one of the unfortunate worst decisions that they've made personnel wise. Was, yes, he was not the same player when he reached free agency and they decided to let him go to Denver. They spent countless years trying to replace him. It wasn't until they got Malcolm Jenkins, I don't know how many years later, that they were able to, really fill that gap. I mean, he meant so much. But like I said, he checked every box at such a high level: pass defense, run defense, blitzer. The intangibles were through the roof. He and Jason Kelce, in my opinion, are the two players that will forever fans will always identify with because of their personality, because they left it out on the field, because they understood what it was like to play in that city and how challenging it is because of how demanding the fan base can be and how intense the fan base can be. He embraced it. He was just so charismatic too, such a great leader. Watching his Hall of Fame speech as well, talking about the struggles that he dealt with early in his career. It was very moving. He's definitely on that Mount Rushmore. He was the guy, for me until the last few years of Kelce. It was always, as a Philadelphia fan, Dawkins was always, for all sports, number one on the field, but also in particular off the field.
My favorite part of Brian Dawkins is literally just him coming on tunnel the Wolverine. That's favorite part of him just coming out and just bring that vibe, bring that energy. It's just fun to watch. That really is.
Yeah. So back in it was 2002. I want to say it had to have been the last year at that stadium. I was a freshman in college at that time. Went down to a game. Eagles were playing the Texans, and Dawkins in that game, he had everything. He had an interception, sack, fumble recovery, but the Eagles also ran a fake punt. I believe it was either a fake punt or a fake field goal. I want to say it was a fake punt, and he caught a touchdown pass on a fake in that game. So I mean, that was a pretty remarkable all-around performance when you think about it for a safety during some of the best performances I've ever seen.
We get to our last player here. For folks that are wondering why I'm wearing a jersey, that's the Packer version of this guy, because I love this guy. That is Reggie White, the minister of defense, I like to call him. Defensive end, particularly his position, pass rusher, played 8 years for the Eagles. He joined the Eagles from playing the UFL. For folks that don't know it, it's pretty much the minor league football, as I like to call it. That's what I prefer it as. He's a Hall of Famer, one-time Defensive Player of the Year with the Eagles, 6 first-team All-Pro, 1 second-team All-Pro, 7 Pro Bowls, made the Eagles Hall of Fame, retired all-time sacks leader in Eagles franchise history with 124, 11 fumble recoveries, 794 tackles, passed away in 2004, rest in peace. And he did not win a Super Bowl with the Eagles, but he did make the mark of the Eagles. After he left, he became the first NFL player to really start NFL free agency, and he went to my team, the Packers, where he got his Super Bowl. But he was statistically one of the best.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the list of sack leaders of all time, certainly Bruce Smith is number one, but Reggie's right there behind him. When you look at, so you mentioned Reggie, 124 sacks during his time with the Eagles over 8 seasons. That was in 121 games. So averaging more than a sack a game, if we were to put that in the context of nowadays, you're looking at a player averaging 17 to 18 sacks a season, and if we were to look at that, this year, that would be one of the best pass rushers in football right now, certainly. When you think about, some of the folks like a Parsons and a Bosa and such. Reggie was that, and he was that for a long, long period of time. And that didn't stop when he went to Green Bay. I personally think we could sit there and analyze so much Reggie versus Bruce Smith. I think Reggie was the most dominant pass rusher of all time. And so when it comes to pure physical skill, I think he is probably the best Eagles player of all time from a pure physical skill standpoint. It's a shame how it ended. Owner was too cheap to give him the money. I mean, I was still fairly young at that time, 7, 8 years old. I remember demonstrations like WIP this was when in Angelo Catali's early time on WIP, them having demonstrations like outside City Hall, if I recall, inciting Norman Brayman, the owner, to pay Reggie and all of that. Reggie deservedly wanted to get paid what he was worth, but it wasn't one of those where a player was like, to heck with this, I want to leave. He wanted to get paid, but he did not want to leave. To my best recollection, the Eagles kind of forced him to leave by not ponying up. The finances and salary caps were different, I believe, at that time. So it's not like, oh, here's this cap casualty. I believe it was the salary cap came into play a few years later after he left. So really, really disappointing how that played out. But yeah, just pure and utter dominance. And the other thing is, I'm not saying that there were less opportunities to rush the passer back then, but it was much more of a running league back then. It wasn't 1960s running style, but it was not the pass happy league that it is now, where I'm not saying it's easier to get sacks, but you have more opportunities to get sacks on passing plays. And we're in a more pass heavy league in 2024 than we were in the late 1980s, early 90s. So I think that is something else to consider. The fact that he was able to register so many sacks when there were less passing plays back then speaks to his dominance.
Definitely, especially with the physicality. Yeah, Buddy Ryan, one of the best defensive-minded coaches of all time. I mean, the Eagles did get far in the postseason a bit, but they ultimately didn't get to go to the Super Bowl that they wanted to with Reggie. And then off the field, if you ever watched the Reggie White documentary on ESPN, where they go about he doesn't want any media press to know he's doing off field. He just wants to do it, not just get publicity. He just wants to do it out of his character. That's what he knows. He'd go to church, he would read the Bible, try to become a minister, and he tried to help people he would help his former Eagles teammate Jerome Brown at the time, who he just tried to be his best friend, try to raise him like his little brother here and there. Just watching videos of him, seeing that smile out of him. The humpback move is like you mentioned, the physicalness. That's the one thing that always sticks out to me. I remember watching a highlight video of him throws an offensive lineman to the quarterback and then just sacks. I think it was Randall Cunningham at the time. Pure dominance is what I would say about him.
When Reggie was in Philadelphia, they had, as I've mentioned, they didn't really help Randall out on the line, but I mean, boy, did they have a stacked defense, because Buddy Ryan, he could identify defenders and he also attracted players to want to play. So if there was a knock that, Reggie also dominated because he had Clyde Simmons on his other side of DN, when he had the limited time with Jerome Brown, which was hard because Jerome Brown would probably be on this list too, based on what his trajectory was if he didn't unfortunately pass away in a car accident. So he had them, Mike Golick, in the middle at one point, great linebackers in terms of Seth Joyner, Byron Evans behind him, some studs in the secondary with Eric Allen, Wes Hopkins at safety. So point being is, you can't make the case that, he also had just some amazing players around him and that allowed him to flourish a little bit more with one-on-one opportunities. No, because he dominated when he went to Green Bay too. Now he's with some great teams with Green Bay, but the fact that he still dominated with Green Bay, maybe it also shows that some of those other players in Philadelphia also put up quality numbers because they also played with Reggie. Complete dominant force. At worst, in my opinion, right now, you could say at worst, he was the second best defensive end of all time, if you want to go Bruce Smith number one. But I think for a lot of people, they're going to tell you he was the best defensive end of all time at this point. What more can you say about that if you're the most dominant at that position of all time?
All right, now we get to the end of the episode here, folks. As we round out to here, we've already mentioned our candidates. We've had some honorable mentions in this episode. So I'll start with our special guest, Dr. Mudrick. Who do you think is the greatest Eagles player in franchise history as of this point to right now today?
This is a tough one for me. I think it's a two-person race at the moment between Reggie White and Brian Dawkins. As much as I think from a pure performance standpoint, it has to be Reggie White. When you look at those numbers, they certainly speak for themselves. The fact that I'm not saying Brian Dawkins he is one of the greatest safeties of all time. He's in the Hall of Fame, but I don't know that Dawkins is at the top of the safety list overall. I certainly would put him behind Ed Reed, and during that time, probably I'm putting him behind a Ronnie Lott.
Yep.
Previous generation. You could debate him versus Polamalu during his time. I'm sure the Pittsburgh fans would, rightfully support their guy and say Polamalu's. I don't have Polamalu's stats off the top of my head. We certainly know he was a great playmaker from a pass defense standpoint, but I think, he certainly is in that mix as well. So I think just when you're looking at a comparison between that player and where they were at their position all time, you got to give it, from a performance standpoint, a slight nod to Reggie White.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're asking me as an Eagles fan, it's Brian Dawkins because of all of the intangibles. I'm not saying Reggie wasn't a great leader. I mean, when he was with Philadelphia, I mean, you certainly have countless stories of him being a leader in Green Bay. But what Brian Dawkins meant to that organization and to that fan base, you can't put a value on. And I'm saying the same thing about Jason Kelce right now. And maybe I'll rethink this in a few years and have Kelce up there, maybe also because he was instrumental in winning a Super Bowl and such. But as an Eagles fan, if I was a voter, if I was an unbiased voter, I'm going Reggie White on this as the greatest Eagle of all time. But as a pure Eagles fan, because that's what fandom is, it's also about the emotional attachment that we have, how we are affectively involved toward our, favorite players, our teams and such, because of how much we identified with Brian Dawkins, the individual. I have Brian Dawkins at the Pantheon in Philadelphia Eagles history.
There you go from Dr. Magic. For me, it comes down to 3 players. You mentioned Kelce, you mentioned Dawkins, White. Statistically, I think it's White. Now, if you want to go off the field, I think it's more Jason Kelce, honestly. He helps support the community a lot. Now, that's not to say with the other guys, too, of Dawkins and White. I think from off-field perspective, I think it's Kelce, but I have to leave it towards more the performance. So I'm going to have to go Reggie White here. Now, Dawkins, he was dominant, but as you mentioned how dominant they were at their position and helping the Eagles out, I think it was Reggie White. He tried to help that team, go far as they can. Now, Kelce, he did it by winning the Super Bowl, but he also had help too. I feel like he had more help than White did, but Reggie just took it to the never level for the Eagles, and I think he really accomplished it there. So I'm going to go Reggie White.
Yeah, I would love to revisit this conversation in a year. Like I mentioned, I'm curious how the Eagles' offensive line is going to function post Jason Kelce. I still think they're going to be good this year, but they're certainly going to take a step back. But again, I go back to we talk so much about the athleticism, but yeah, the smarts of being able to make those calls. I'm really curious how that is going to operate this year without him there. And maybe that's going to make us realize, wow, he was even more valuable than we thought he was. And think about the off-field stuff. Kelce's going to be a part of the community in that city forever. Yeah, he's going to probably go on to do national media stuff and be incredibly successful. But I think many of us can see him staying, in the suburbs, so to speak, and still being visible. Yeah, I mean, there's that extra element with Kelce of just such, not that these other guys weren't likable, but Jason Kelce was so, because there was a goofy likability. Yeah, the intangibles that he has, it's still kind of raw with him retiring. So I'm curious if in a year I and others might say, no, we even maybe not 1A, absolutely number 1 now. So we shall see.
Yes, we shall definitely see. But that's the end of our episode here. I'd like to thank Dr. Metric for coming on, our Eagles expert. Now, folks, if you disagree with us, you leave in the comments right off the bat. If you're saying Nick Foles, which I think a lot of people are going to say that off the bat, I mean, he won the Super Bowl, but if we're looking from a pure best player performance, I mean, honestly, he had the great story in the backup and all that, but the tenure and all the succeeding, we consider that more. If he produced more successful seasons.
If we're just talking about all-time performances, yeah, he's up there because that Super Bowl performance he was just so locked in. I mean, certainly as many Eagles fans, we've probably watched the Super Bowl 52 over and over and over hundreds of times. But, every time that's on and I watch it, I key in on when they converted on 4th down in the 4th quarter or keep the drive going to be able to eventually take the lead. But there was a play, 1 or 2 plays after that, where he hits Aguilar in the middle of the field where he basically he put it in between 2 defenders that the window was so small and he just ripped it, all the confidence. He was so locked in. That pass to Corey Clement for the, touchdown, whether Patriots fans will tell you whether those 2 feet were in or not, that's an argument for another day, but he was so locked in. So yeah, if we're talking about singular performances, he has to be up there. And I will say, it's not like he was just a flash in the pan for one season. His 27-2 year was amazing. And during that season, I mean, he took them down and got them the lead against New Orleans in the playoffs. It was the defense that gave it up to Drew Brees and they lost to the Saints. And, the following year after the Super Bowl with Wentz getting hurt again late in the year, going into LA and beating the Rams again, beating the Texans at the end of the year, beating the Bears. So he did have that run. However, we blame Alshon, and Alshon Jeffrey was, no offense, culpable for dropping the ball against the Saints that following year, which led to an interception. Nick didn't really play that well in that game. He started off strong when they built the 2-score lead, and then he kind of fizzled at that point. And we tend to forget, not trying to discount. I mean, he's up there as well. 2 more years of good to solid play. Yes, he's absolutely in the conversation.
Again, leave your thoughts in the comments of who you think is the greatest, who should have been mentioned on this list, who should have been honorable mentions, because we mentioned a bunch of honorable mentions. I feel honestly mentioned that like kind of our Mount Rushmore a little bit. Like there are 3-4 key guys that definitely deserved on this. You can make the argument for another one. I still vote Steve Van Buren to be on that list.
I think, another honorable mention that I didn't include, I think Lane Johnson's got to be on that list. I think he's probably got, another year or 2 left in him. But the fact that he has given up so few sacks in such a heavy passing league, going multiple seasons without giving up 1 sack. He himself, when you look at, Eagles fans will probably tell you, when he plays versus when he doesn't play, their record is substantially different. I'm not saying it's an Embiid Sixers versus a non-Embiid, but it's pretty remarkable, his importance, because the other thing is when Lane is out there is no thought about having to chip on the right side. They know one-on-one he's going to take care of their guy. Micah Parsons will feast against most offensive tackles in football, but when he's against Lane, that typically doesn't happen, and you're not sending extra help over there ever, and that allows the offense to operate better because you have 1 extra guy. You never have to worry about that with Lane Johnson. Again, another guy that Eagles fans identify greatly with a lot of the issues that he's overcome. He's a very, very relatable guy as well. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him as honorable mention as well. I'm still very thankful they drafted him and that Miami snagged Deion Jordan in that draft, because it's from all reports sounded like Chip Kelly wanted to take Deion Jordan given the Oregon ties, but instead he was scooped up and they went with Lane Johnson. And the fact that he was like a converted quarterback to tackle at Oklahoma, that only adds to the mystique of his story. So just such a great player. Definitely going to miss him when he does hang it up, which I assume is going to be in the near future. So I think he needs to be at least mentioned on this list as well.
I mean, another guy I think of too that we can make the argument for is Brandon Graham or Fletcher Cox too. Like Brandon Graham had the key sack on Tom Brady in the Super Bowl, which ultimately helped Eagles win the Super Bowl. Like you can't forget about that. Like that's a key important play too from the Super Bowl.
Going back to Cox, Pro Football Reference approximate value chart that they have him number 5 all time for the Eagles. So, and then there's a pretty considerable drop off after that. So they have him at a 121. So just for reference for our audience, they have Kelsey number 1. They've got Reggie White number 2, McNabb 3, Dawkins 4, Fletcher Cox 5. Cox rates out at 121. Randall Cunningham is 6. He is at a 105. And so all the others are pretty close in that top 5. And then there's a considerable drop off. So yeah, Fletcher Cox, obviously. I'm curious what the discussion is going to be and however many years it's going to be when he's going to be eligible for the Hall of Fame. But yeah, certainly a stalwart on that line. Part of how the NFL, certainly we place a lot of value on edge rushers. But nowadays, when we look at the contracts that were given out this offseason, so much more emphasis on interior pass rushing as well. And I think we saw that, that was kind of the quote unquote template. If you want to get at Brady, you got to get him up the A gaps up, in the middle. You got to put pressure on the middle and get in their face and all that. But Fletcher Cox really embodied, that stout defensive tackle that could also, rush the passer extremely well.
Once again, folks, make sure you leave your thoughts and comments in the chat, subscribe, and leave a like on this video here. Once again, this is episode 5, first episode of the NFC East. Next episode, we'll be heading towards the Washington Commanders, and then we'll go to the Giants, and then we'll go for America's team, the Cowboys, who still stink, according to Eagle fans. We'll see you next time here, folks. That's a wrap in the studio.